Hi folks, my name is Adam Metter and welcome to my presentation about open source software. I'm going to start off with a quote here. Free software is the first battle in the liberation of cyberspace. It was said by a man named Richard Stallman. Alright, what is open source software? It's basically software that is open for users to inspect, modify, and ultimately change for the betterment of everyone. Why is it so great? Often open source software is free to use and free to tinker with and available for most computer operating systems, including Windows and Mac OS. Okay, we're going to take it back to 1971. We need to talk about a man named Richard Stallman. He's an important figure in the history of open source software. I'm sure we've all had a moment as educators where we wanted to destroy the printer that we have access to. Well, Richard Stallman, he encountered these same frustrations, and essentially a printer jam sparked him onto a lifelong mission. Okay, so in 1971, a young Harvard student and hackers back then were different than we think of hackers now. His name was Richard Stallman. He became increasingly annoyed with the brand new Xerox laser printer at his place of employment, which was the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab. Previously, Richard had enjoyed the ability to access and modify the source code of the old printer, which allowed him to fix some common problems, specifically paper jams. However, with the newly acquired Xerox laser printer that got donated to them, the source code was inaccessible. And Richard, he even requested, but was ultimately denied the source code to the new printer. They actually said, no, you can't have it. And as you can imagine, this annoyed Richard to not be able to access the code to fix paper jam problems and notifications. Now, the larger picture of the printer story, as it's called, is that intellectual property and proprietary software were becoming increasingly partitioned. So this annoyed Richard that uh, this mindset of openness and free exchange of ideas and code and software that was starting to kind of close down and get more commercialized. So the early 70s saw this openness and exchange of ideas give way to proprietary concerns and making money off of intellectual property. So this paradigm shift prompted Richard to take action, so he quit his job and started up something called New. Throwing it back to 1984, we got a new kid on the block. It's 1984, Richard Stallman begins the New project and the New OS. Stallman named his completely free operating system with the recursive acronym News Not Unix. And in his 2014 TED Talk, Stallman states that with software there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program or the program controls the users. It is inevitably one or the other. With Stallman, the word free was meant not to connote a software's price, but rather its freedom. He states, free software respects the user's freedom and community, Libra, not gratis. His four essential freedoms needed to control a program are these. Freedom 0, you may run the program as you wish. Freedom 1, you must be able to study the source code and change it to do the computing that you want. Freedom 2, redistribute exact copies. Freedom 3, redistribute it with changes. These four essential freedoms are the tenets of the open source software movement. So you'll see those kind of four ideas come into play when you speak about open source. Now, in 1992, there was a man named Linus Torvalds. He was the creator of Linux, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. He released this thing called the Linux kernel. Linux was another open source and free operating system. The kernel is a bridge between apps and the processing done at the hardware level. Well, the release of Linus Torvalds' Linux kernel, this filled the gap of the development of the new operating system. So it took a while. It took about a little less than 10 years for the new OS to get off the ground, and the last final piece of the puzzle was the Linux kernel that Linus Torvalds released to the public. And it ushered in the era of the new Linux, completely free operating system that you could run on your personal computer. Alright, what's in a name? Well, the name open source software is attributed to this lady, Christine Peterson. Well, in 1988, while working at the Foresight Institute in Palo Alto, California, Silicon Valley, Christine Peterson coined the term open source. Now, initially the term free software was deemed inadequate. This is because the word free it has connotation as and often associated with having no price. Well, This annoyed the developers and software people, and they wanted to express the idea that Stallman had as Libre not gratis. Okay, they wanted to connote freedom, not the monetary cost. Okay, so Christine dreamt up the term open source. Now, other names were on the short list, including freely distributable, cooperatively developed, and sourceware. They almost sound like they're educators. Christine, she had her coworker, Todd Anderson, who was a programmer, kind of casually drop in the name open source into their meeting discussion with all the programmers. Well, at the end of the meeting, they formally circled back and named, the name that they were floating around, open source, that Christine suggested and had her friend Todd drop in. It stuck. So the term status was cemented further by the subsequent release of the Netscape browser source code, where in that source code they referred to it as open source on their website. Alright, let's take it back to 1994. Well, we got Netscape Navigator versus Internet Explorer. That battle, ultimately, from the ashes of that, we get Mozilla, which is a name you've probably heard. Now, the release of Netscape Navigator and the source code for it is widely viewed as an important milestone in the history of open source. Well, circa 1994, Netscape Navigator was one of your only options to browse the web on a personal computer. Then the following year, 1995, Microsoft released Internet Explorer. This rivalry between the companies, it ultimately, that was just the two of them. Ultimately, Microsoft garnered nearly 95% of the market by 1999. So in that 4 years' time of the release of Internet Explorer, Microsoft just dominated. So this prompted the folks at Netscape to release the source code for Netscape Navigator. If you can't beat them, just release the source code. Enter the Mozilla Foundation in 1998. They had the wild idea that by releasing the source code, you could crowdsource innovation by putting it in the hands of programmers and developers. Fast forward to the 2002 release of one of the web's most beloved browsers, Firefox. August 25th, 1991, University of Helsinki student Linus Torvalds posts a message on a message board. Hello, everybody out there using Linux. That was the operating system on the new computer he had. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby. Won't be a big and professional operating system like GNU for 386 and 486 AT clones. I'd like any feedback on things people dislike or like about Linux, as my new operating system resembles it somewhat. Now, Linus was dissatisfied with the operating system of his new computer, and he longed for Unix, which was what he was used to. However, the cheapest copy that he could find of Unix was the low price of $5,000. So Linus set out to make his own operating system, and this was the birth of Linux, an important operating system and milestone in the timeline of open source history. In 1999, a company called Sun Microsystems, they acquired an office productivity suite called Star Office, and a year later, Sun Microsystems released the source code, and the open source productivity suite, OpenOffice, was born. Now fast forward to 2011, OpenOffice is acquired by a company called Oracle. There's office shakeups, acquisitions, and rebrandings, and ultimately that led to the offshoot of OpenOffice, another office productivity suite called LibreOffice. These are essentially suites similar to Microsoft Office that are free and available on a Mac or PC. In 2003, a group of California software developers set out to build digital camera software. Fast forward to 2005, Google acquired Android Inc., the maker of that digital camera software, and redirects its focus to making mobile operating systems for phones. Now, once again, Linus Torvalds' famous kernel comes into play as a crucial component for the successful beginnings of the mobile operating system called Android. Now, however, much to the chagrin of more gung-ho open source purists, the presence of the Linux kernel is downplayed. Now, regardless, the Android mobile operating system today is one of the most widely distributed and installed phone operating systems. The core code is open source and owned by Alphabet, Google's parent company, and it's also underpinned with the open source Linux kernel. Now, without open source software of this type, Android and the mobile variety, the landscape of mobile computing would be widely different and arguably worse for the wearer. Necessity and frustration in the past have been the great facilitators of the open source movement. Throwback to Richard Stallman and his paper jams, and Linus Torvald getting frustrated because he wanted his operating system that certain way that he liked it, ultimately sparked a movement that leveled the playing field in regards to expensive proprietary software. So frustration, cost, a necessity. These are all things that propelled the open source software movement, and as educators we rely on these open source software solutions to help us teach. Now that leads to my next point in regards to why open source is important in education. It has to do with the gratis, not Libra. Okay, educators are always looking for inexpensive classroom solutions, and not only that, but often we want to put those same inexpensive solutions in the hands of our students at home.